The first phone call I ever got from my wife's grandmother wasn't to complain about anything. It was to thank me for driving 4 hours in the rain to fix a leaky roof nobody else in that family had bothered to look at in a decade. 11 years later, that same family stood in a semicircle around me at a lake in North Carolina and waited for me to say I was sorry. I didn't. That's the story. Welcome to Dad's Pure Revenge. If you're new here, stick around and drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if this kind of story matters to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. I want to start with Nana Ruth, because none of this makes sense without her. Ruth Hartwell was 84 years old the summer this happened, and she still hung her own laundry on a line behind a cabin she'd owned since 1969, on a stretch of shoreline on Lake Jocassee that the rest of the family called the property, like it was a business asset, instead of the place where she raised 4 kids and buried a husband. She was the only one in my wife's family who ever asked me a question about myself and then actually waited for the answer. When my son was born early and spent 9 days in the NICU, Ruth drove 3 hours by herself, sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room, and didn't say a word about needing anything. She just brought a thermos of coffee and handed me a cup without asking if I wanted one. She knew I did. My name is Grant Whitfield. I was 44 that summer. I inspect commercial elevators for a living, which is a stranger job than it sounds, and I'd been married to Denise Hartwell for 13 years. My honest flaw, the one I'll admit to you straight, is that I let things go too long before I said anything. I'd sit through a comment that stung, tell myself it wasn't worth the fight, and swallow it. I did that for over a decade with Denise's family. I want to tell you now, before this story even gets going, that swallowing things doesn't make them disappear. It just changes where they land later. The reunion happened the second weekend of July, at Ruth's cabin, like it did every year. Denise's mother, Roberta, ran it the way she ran everything. A laminated schedule, assigned parking spots, a seating chart for a picnic table. Roberta had never liked me. Not loudly. She was the kind of cold that doesn't raise its voice. She'd ask about my job with a tone that made it sound like a hobby. She once referred to my side of the family, in front of my own son, as modest, and smiled when she said it. Saturday, July 11th, around 4:30 in the afternoon, my son Caleb, who was 9 that year, was down by the dock with Roberta's grandson, Trip, who was 12. Trip told Caleb his sneakers were the cheap kind, and that his dad, meaning me, probably couldn't afford the good ones. Caleb came and found me by the grill, and he didn't cry. He just asked me, real quiet, if we were poor. That's the sentence that did it, not the insult itself. The fact that a 9-year-old had to ask his father that question at a family cookout. I walked down to the dock, and I said, calmly, that Trip needed to apologize to my son. Roberta was closer than I realized. She said, "He's 12, Grant. It's a joke. Don't make a scene." I said it wasn't a joke to Caleb. Denise's brother, Wade, laughed and said I was awfully sensitive for a grown man. I said something back. I'm not going to pretend I handled it with perfect grace. I told him to teach his son some manners, and within about 90 seconds, the whole reunion had stopped talking to each other and started watching me. Nobody defended Caleb. That's the part I keep circling back to. 20-some people, and not one of them said, actually, that wasn't okay to say to a 9-year-old. They looked at me like I was the disruption. Denise pulled me aside by the woodpile. I want to be fair to her here, because she wasn't cruel about it. She was scared, the way people get when they've spent their whole life managing their mother's moods. She said, "You embarrassed me in front of everyone." I said Caleb had been embarrassed first. She said, "You have 2 options. Apologize to Wade and to my mother, or you can go on and leave." She said it flat, not yelling, which somehow made it land harder than if she had. I looked at her for a second. I remember exactly how long the pause was, because I counted it without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, before I answered. "Then I'll go." If you've ever been the only person in a room who's decided something is actually over, You know it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet. The door didn't slam. That almost made it worse. There was one person who didn't just stand there. Ruth's youngest daughter, Denise's Aunt Colleen, found me loading the truck and put a paper plate of cornbread and ribs in my hands without asking if I wanted it, the same way Ruth used to hand me coffee. She said, "You did right by that boy." That was it. She didn't make a speech. She just said it, and then she went back inside before her sister Roberta could see her say it. I want to tell you what I noticed before I left, because at the time, I didn't think anything of it. Ruth had asked me, back in June, if I'd come a day early to the reunion and help her get some paperwork notarized at a bank in Salem. Updates to her estate, she'd said. Nothing urgent. I'd told her I would. I hadn't gotten to it yet. As I was pulling the truck door shut, I saw her standing on the porch, not saying anything, just watching me go. I waved. She didn't wave back. She just nodded. Once, like she was filing something away. I drove to the airport in Asheville that night. I didn't book anything on the way. I sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes with the engine off, and then I bought a one-way ticket home to Bristol, Tennessee, and I texted Denise one line, "I'll be at the house." Take your time. I found out later that my phone, sitting silent in my pocket on that flight, was the least interesting thing happening back at that cabin. Monday, July 13th, 9:14 in the morning. Denise called me 11 times before I landed and saw any of it. By that evening, it was 29 missed calls. By Wednesday, it was 34. Roberta had never called me directly in 13 years of marriage. She called 4 times that week. I didn't pick up any of them yet. Not out of spite. I genuinely didn't know what I'd say. Here's what I didn't know, and what none of them expected me to find out. Ruth hadn't just wanted paperwork notarized. She'd wanted her will changed, and she'd wanted me, specifically me, not her son, not Roberta, not a family lawyer she'd used for 30 years and who golfed with Wade, to be the one who helped her do it. Because she said, and I'm told she said this almost word for word to the new attorney she called that Monday morning, "Grant's the only one who ever showed up without being asked." I didn't decide to leave the family behind that weekend. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a better story if I'd had some grand plan. I just decided I was done being the only adult in the room who had to explain himself. The switch that flipped wasn't rage. It was simpler than that. It was the realization that I'd spent 13 years auditioning for people who'd already decided the verdict, and I finally stopped trying the case. Ruth passed away that October, 11 weeks after the reunion, in her sleep, in the same cabin. I flew back for the funeral. I sat in the back pew. Roberta didn't look at me once. Denise sat beside me and held my hand through the whole service, and that was the first sign that something had shifted in her too. Not forgiveness for her family, just an honest look at them, finally, without the filter she'd worn her whole life. The will was read the following Tuesday in a small office on Main Street in Salem, North Carolina. I wasn't invited. Denise was, as Ruth's granddaughter. She called me from the parking lot afterward, and her voice had a kind of stunned flatness to it I'd never heard from her. Ruth had left the cabin and 11 acres on Lake Jocassee, worth, by then, somewhere north of $600,000, into a trust. Not to Roberta, who'd spent 30 years assuming it was hers. Not divided evenly among the grandchildren the way everyone assumed. The trust named Caleb and his younger sister Marlo as beneficiaries to be managed until they turned 25, with one line specifying that Grant Whitfield, me, was to serve as trustee until then. Roberta found out in that office, in front of her own children, that the sister who'd defended a 9-year-old with a paper plate of cornbread had known about the change for weeks and hadn't said a word. Wade found out that the man he'd called awfully sensitive was now the one deciding when his own son could set foot on that dock again. I heard later, because these things always get told, eventually, by someone who was in the room, that Roberta's exact words were, she wouldn't have done this if she'd been in her right mind. A lawyer who'd known Ruth for 6 years, who'd sat with her for 2 separate competency evaluations, Ruth had insisted on herself before signing anything, was standing right there when she said it. Nobody in that room believed Roberta. I think that might have stung her more than losing the cabin did. There was no scene where I confronted Roberta. I want to be honest with you about that too. Some of these stories build to a big face-to-face moment, and I've heard plenty of them, and I understand why people want that. But the confrontation, if you want to call it that, happened over the phone. Months later, when Roberta finally called to ask if she could still bring her grandkids to the lake for the 4th of July. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I told her the cabin's calendar was full through the summer and that Caleb would let his cousins know when there was an opening. There wasn't an opening. She understood that without me spelling it out. I don't carry anger about Roberta anymore. And I want to be truthful that this isn't a story where she apologized and we all sat around that same dock making new memories. She didn't apologize. As far as I know, she still tells people at that reunion, smaller now, without the lake house, that I turned an old woman against her own daughter. I used to think I'd need her to see it differently before I could feel settled about any of it. I don't need that anymore. That's the part that surprised me most. Denise and I are still married. She and I talk now about things we used to let slide, and some weeks that's harder than the silence ever was. But it's honest, and I'll take honest. Caleb is 12 now. Last summer, I taught him how to recaulk the dock boards at Ruth's cabin, the same boards Ruth had me fix the year Marlo was born. He asked me, halfway through, why great-grandma Ruth left it to him and his sister instead of to Grandma Roberta. I told him the truth, that Ruth left things to people who showed up, and that showing up is a decision you make more than once, not just the one time somebody's watching. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's that boundaries aren't the same thing as cruelty, even when the people on the other side of them tell you they are. Knowing what you're worth isn't something anyone else gets to decide for you, no matter how many chairs they've got set up at the table. If this story meant something to you, or if it reminded you of your own family and your own table, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Give this video a like if you believe showing up is worth more than an apology, and subscribe to Dad's Pure Revenge for more stories just like it. I'll see you in the next one.